Welcome everybody. My name is Creon Butler, and I'm the Director of the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. And it's my great pleasure today to host this Chatham House Special Session on trade and climate change in the context of COP26. While there's been a long-running debate on the interaction between trade policy and environment, and indeed some of that came up in the previous session, as far as I can see, it has not to date been a major focus of either multilateral trade negotiations or climate change negotiations. This in part reflects very different perspectives countries have taken on this issue. Indeed, until very recently, I would have argued that the last thing you want to do if you're going to have a successful UK COP26 summit next year is to put a focus on this issue. But as the need for urgent action on climate change has become ever clearer, and yet the extent of consensus among countries on how to deliver this has diminished, it now seems unavoidable. Those countries which are determined to step up action on climate change, despite the facts that some other major economies are unlikely to follow suit, are looking closely at how they can do this without putting their own economies at a competitive disadvantage. And the EU's current consultation on options to implement border carbon adjustment mechanisms is a foretaste of this. Like many other global issues, this has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The rethinking of global supply chains on the focus on building back better may even create some opportunities to look at this issue in a more constructive way than might have been the case in the past. So today, our focus will be on the trade policy aspects of climate change, how this issue is likely to play out over the next 1 to 2 years, and what policymakers can and should do to try and ensure we get a positive and constructive outcome. To discuss these issues, I'm delighted that we have two highly expert and distinguished speakers. Jodie Keane is Senior Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London, specializing in trade and development issues. From 2015 to 2020, she was an economic advisor in the Trade, Oceans and Natural Resources Directorate of the Commonwealth Secretariat, leading the Institute's advocacy work on emerging trade issues. She's also worked for the World Bank in Vietnam and Cambodia and has taught at SOAS and the LSE. And she has published widely, including editing volumes on global value chains and less developed countries. And our second panelist, Rohinton Medhora, is president of the leading Canadian think tank, Centre for International Governance Innovation, which he joined in 2012. Prior to that, he was vice president of programs at Canada's International Development Research Centre. And he has served and is serving on a wide range of global commissions, including most recently the Lancet and Financial Times Commission on Governing Health Futures 2030, as well as the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, co-chaired by Michael Spence and Joseph Stiglitz. He's published extensively, including authoring a number of books on development and finance, and he has a long association with the University of Toronto, where he studied economics, culminating in a PhD. Now, before we get started, I'll just reiterate a few key housekeeping reminders. This session is on the record, no Chatham House rule or anything of that kind. After some introductory comments from each speaker and some follow-up questions from me, we will open it up to Q&A from the audience, and we'd very much welcome if you could post your questions through the Q&A function. It'd be great if you could keep the questions as short and succinct as possible, because that makes it easier for me to read them out and also to get in as many as possible. And also if you could give your affiliation, that would be really helpful as well. And we have a hard finish at 16:50. So what I hope now is that Rohinton and Jodie will be able to join by switching on their videos. Fantastic. Welcome, welcome guys. That all worked remarkably well. And Rohinton, perhaps I could start with a question to you. You've been following the evolution of global governance over many years. And the issue of trade and climate change clearly brings together two of the most important challenges in the global economic architecture. So how do you see this nexus of issues developing over the next 1 to 2 years? Thank you.
Creon, first, thank you for having me, and thank you to the organizers for having me. I'd much rather be in Brighton or London with you all, but I will make that caveat to begin. And actually, the answer to your opening question, in my view, how do I see trade and climate change evolving, is connected to the pandemic. I think it's hugely connected to how we see global cooperation happen around the pandemic. So let me spend my opening 4 or 5 minutes just fleshing out that thought. We know that in global issues, the urgent crowds out the important. And what we're in is a good example of that. I think both the pandemic the climate change, I know I should switch off my phone. I just did it. Raise existential questions. But the fact of the matter is we need to address both. And until COVID came around, there was a sense that when it came to trade cooperation, we were in a bit of a lull. In fact, things were falling apart. I still think that's the case. But let me sort of raise for you 2 or 3 points which might lead to movement on the trade and climate change side on account of COVID. So the first point I'd make is on border carbon adjustments, which we've talked about on and off this afternoon, or others have, that these are a necessary but not sufficient part of the solution. The WTO is amply suited to deal with this kind of regime for 2 reasons. One, as the pandemic reminded us, you cannot do this piecemeal. You cannot say, you know, Canada, I've kind of sorted out climate change and we'll deal with it if the rest of the world hasn't. So in the face of spillovers, we need a global sort of regime, hence the WTO. Second, Article 20 of the WTO, in fact, specifically gives countries the opening to create legislation that helps them preserve their natural resources and preserve the environment. And I'd make the case that there's a stronger case for the WTO to work on issues like climate change than some of the other subjects like competition and investment that the WTO has been made to get into. So I think the case is strong, and COVID reminds us of that in a number of ways. If we're going to make movement on trade and climate change, I think it needs to be done in 2 dimensions. So on the one hand, we could say we're all in this together. And as part of that all in this together logic, we need a global border carbon adjustments regime that is transparent, that is fair, that's easy to understand and implement. And we can certainly get into all those details, but we can make that broad case. And increasingly, as more and more countries move to domestic carbon pricing, the next logical step is to say, how do we adjust differential carbon pricing regimes at the border and both bring the gains of greenery as well as prevent some of the carbon dumping fears? But I don't think we're going to get to this unless we deal with the second aspect of trade and climate change, which is again where COVID comes in. And that has to do with innovation and technology. So I'm going to, in this case, include TRIPS as part of the trade and climate change agenda and say, you know, pricing will get us so far, and in fact, quite far. But think of a case in which there's a step change in technology. Be it the vaccine and COVID, or in our case, for the purposes of this session, think about a step change improvement in carbon capture and storage, or in the capacity of solar cells to store energy. You want this kind of technology to be adopted by everyone quickly and adopted by absolutely everyone. Like a vaccine, this is not something you can do piecemeal. TRIPS is the exact opposite. TRIPS is almost designed to slow things down and prevent people from adopting technologies with positive spillover effects, when what climate change calls for is the opposite. And here I think COVID kind of comes to the rescue, because we have now seen with the vaccine and with the discussions, quite public discussions about herd immunity, that we don't have the luxury of having technological change and have it implemented only in countries that want to do it or can afford to do it. And so COVAX and some of the initiatives around cooperation in science leave some room for hope that if COP and the WTO kind of got their act together and combined changes in the way we manage or see intellectual property, including compulsory licensing, which is no longer seen as a bad word, with economic pricing and incentive structures, there might be movement on climate change in the next 2 years of the sort that we have not seen so far.
Rohinton, thank you very much. I mean, that's a very, very clear, very cogent, and in a sense quite practical suggestion as to how we could move forward. I mean, there are a great many questions that I'd like to come back to you, but maybe if first, Jodie, I could come to you. And I know that you've for some time focused on the sort of emerging trade issues, which has included this question of how environment and trade should interact, and also very much with the perspective of the poorest developing countries. So how do you see this issue developing over the next 1 to 2 years? And in particular, what do you think should our overall strategy be, you know, as a complement, if you like, to what Rohinton has said?
Yeah, I think that was a really excellent point to have ended on, the point about technology, because, you know, this is one area of overhang from COP25 and probably, you know, COPs before that as well, where, you know, agreement on the need for technology was reached, but implementation just remains extremely vague. And the point about, you know, trying to secure greater flexibilities, you know, there was the inclusion of trade and the environment, these sorts of the points that have been mentioned by the previous speaker within the DDA, but obviously we've moved, you know, well beyond the DDA, and even talking about reviving the DDA, you know, you get hit over the head with. But, you know, there was a lot of relevant points to do with the trade and the environment within the DDA. And I think that, you know, we should, as the trade community, should try to ensure that these are discussed, you know, because these areas of overhang, there are other areas of overhang from COP25, which also have trade-related implications. You know, the trade community does need to you know, try to revive them. We've got to try to secure mutually supportive regimes. So I would urge, you know, let's, you know, border carbon adjustment measures are important, but they are diverting attention from the broader COP26 agenda and all of these difficult issues that need to be resolved. Issues around transparency, issues around technology, finance, and so on. There are lessons that the trade community can bring to the UNFCCC negotiation process. And, you know, we need to think creatively about how these two institutions will interact. It's encouraging that the number of environmental measures that are being reported by countries is increasing. You know, that's great, but what does the WTO do with this information? You know, how is this information being used? Because looking ahead, the level of ambition needs to be raised, you know, substantially by a factor of 3 if we're to reach the 2-degree temperature rise in coming decades, or by a factor of 6. You know, so once that level of ambition ramps up, you know, the WTO, the trade policy review mechanism, the role of the Committee for the Trade and Environment, you know, these institutional arrangements will need to be bolstered. So I think that there are kind of specific negotiating areas within COP26 that are directly trade related. So we need to start teasing them out so that we have a kind of constructive agenda that both climate change negotiators can use and also trade negotiators can use. And that's what that part of my work at the ODI has been trying to draw those aspects out.
Thanks very much. Well, maybe I could sort of tackle a sort of broader question that Rohinton flagged, but also Jodie, you've come back on. I mean, the immediate question is this something, if you like, you can fix at the multilateral level, or in a sense, you have to redesign intellectual property protection at a national level in order to have a multilateral system that then enables you to take this step? I mean, as soon as you start reducing, if you like, the incentives to innovate, as some people would see it, the gains from innovation and so on, you open a whole structure of things to look at. And although, I would be the first to agree that, the kind of protection we have now, the rules are almost arbitrary, and how much protection you have, there's no kind of real economic justification as to why you should have, patent protection for so long, or IP protection for so long. Nonetheless, it seems to be something that is very fundamental in national systems. So maybe, Rohinton, I can just come back to you and just sort of pursue that issue that you've raised. Do you think it is something that is going to require whole scale reform of intellectual property protection, particularly in the area of these crucial goods necessary for rapid climate transition? Or is it something that somehow at that international level, one can make some necessary changes to, and that in itself would be enough to create this sort of package deal?
Right. And in fact, Michael in the chat raises that same question very pointedly, exactly. Which is there, if you liberalize TRIPS, will we kind of kill the goose that's laying the golden egg? And then I think there's a number of issues to be unpacked. My short answer is no, you won't. So let me begin there, and then I'll come, Creon, to your point about multilateral versus national. The relationship between protection for IP and innovation is a complex one, and it's not strictly linear. My best understanding of the literature is that it's almost like a bell curve, where in the left half, as you increase protection, in fact, you provide incentives to innovators to innovate, because there are huge fixed costs. Unlike, your proverbial person tinkering in the garage in the old days, we know that in pharma and in high tech that there are huge fixed costs that have to be recuperated. Got that. But then there's also a point beyond which more and more protection actually decreases innovation for a number of reasons. One, you're sort of reducing the size of the market. Second, innovation thrives on exchanges of ideas, and these get constricted as you have more restrictions. And third, there is such a thing as predatory behavior, in which monopolists who benefit from IP protection take out, as it were, competition at early stages and prevent innovation from happening. And my understanding is that we're at the stage where kind of now to the right of that bell curve. So as a general proposition, I'm not willing to accept that more and more liberalization leads to less and less innovation. Second, there are market-friendly ways that respect incentives, and this comes to your point, Creon, about multilateralism, which can create technologies for the public good. So one such solution is advanced market commitments, which we have seen play out in certain types of vaccine, in which, in the case of AMCs, the Gates Foundation and several countries, the UK and Canada included, create a pool of resources which will be used by poor countries or whoever to purchase the technology at a market price. So you're not penalizing innovation. Second, I always come back to an overlooked part of the development system, CGIAR, international agriculture, in which you create a global system of R&D in which patents are held in the public interest, and in fact, huge advances in nutrition and in hunger alleviation can be attributed to the creation of that CGIAR and related systems, which we don't celebrate enough. There's also models like Prize X, in which you simply create a grand challenge and then provide the incentive for someone to come up with a solution. So I don't think that it's necessarily the case that if we liberalize TRIPS, we're going to penalize the private sector. My final point on international versus national is I do agree with you that some of this change has to begin nationally. And the fact is we're now in a TRIPS plus plus era in which the US in particular, through its bilateral and regional trade agreements, is ratcheting up TRIPS provisions in situations where it has more bargaining power, and actually creating an even more enhanced TRIPS at a time when we should be thinking of less. And I turn to the EU and your GDPR. Data is another example where you want a uniform global regime, but one has to start somewhere. And what the GDPR does by starting in the EU is it creates a global benchmark that frankly many countries outside your zone aspire to. And even countries, dare I say, wishing to leave the EU, wish to mimic the GDPR in some of its provisions. And so the EU's work on border carbon adjustments might be seen in the same vein, that you create a benchmark. Clearly, you need a global regime, but you create the benchmark and then use global governance processes to get more and more countries on board.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a very clear response. Perhaps, Jodie, I could come to you and sort of follow that question, because you've talked about the existing architecture in the WTO for looking at trade and environment issues. And I think, I mean, your view is that this needs to be developed and expanded almost as like an infrastructure in order to be able to tackle these issues more effectively in the future. And I think we've discussed before, and you've mentioned, if you like, the large number of exemptions that have been notified, and what's actually happened to all that information. Is anybody doing anything with it, and so on. So I wonder if you could sort of give a sense of in what areas you think the architecture should be developed, because I think this would be very pertinent to a new Director General of the WTO to sort of, if you like, lead off on the process, and then from the process move into the substance potentially. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So probably I'll follow on from the previous discussion around the IPR, because one of the priorities for the UK leading into COP26 is the discussions around nature-based solutions. And this is sought to kind of broaden out the previous discussions around the RED initiative, which is the reduced emissions from deforestation and land degradation. The RED initiative. So it's been broadened out to the nature-based solutions, and it's to encompass both these adaptation and mitigation aspects, recognizing the role of ecosystems and biodiversity. It's kind of poignant that, we've had the WTO ministerial has been delayed, COP26 has been delayed, and also the discussions around the UN Convention on Biological Diversity have also been delayed. And within those discussions, it is recognised that there are trade-related implications, and that includes with regards to intellectual property and the TRIPS agreement. So there are kind of, two schools, if you like, that say that, the TRIPS will need to be amended to take into account, what is agreed under the convention, because it is recognised that there will be trade-related implications. And then on the other hand, there are those that say, no, you can work within the existing framework of rules. I think, the level of ambition, if we are to secure and limit the temperature increases that we know that are coming, much bolder action needs to be taken. When I've been discussing this with colleagues, I've been talking about, thinking about the role of the Committee for Trade and the Environment, thinking about, the trade policy review process, looking at notifications and thinking, how, where does this information go? Who makes decisions? And I was thinking, is there a need for some specific committee on climate change? Because perhaps, this issue goes beyond just the environment. We're talking about the carbon, itself, which is, kind of derived, and no one is really talking about that at the moment. But someone did say to me, if you create another committee, that's one way to kill it as well. So perhaps we need, something like a waiver. And this is something that Pascal Lamy, one of the previous DGs, has mentioned. And the point that he made was that already the trading landscape is so distorted already. We've got fossil fuel subsidies, which we haven't really touched on yet, but the trading landscape is so distorted. So until we get those distortions, until we remove those distortions, we can't really take, the right framework. We can't design it yet. So perhaps we need some kind of waiver that enables, some actions to be taken. We're not moving down a kind of legalistic tit for tat retaliate measures route. Perhaps that's the way that we should go. A kind of two-step approach. It could also provide the space. And the space for countries to be really creative and really ambitious, which we know that countries need to do within a very short amount of time. I hope that's answered your question.
No, that's very good. I mean, essentially, you're saying this would give space to countries to do things which might not be within the terms of Article 20, but would somehow be limited. So it would be, there would be the space to innovate, to explore within reason, even if it went beyond Article 20, exactly, or could be defended under Article 20. Well, that's I think that's an interesting idea for a new piece of architecture. I mean, Rohinton, you might want to comment on the architecture point as well, but perhaps I could also just ask you about the sort of broader political approach that's going to be needed in the future. I mean, we've talked about this before. You've mentioned the role of the EU. Interestingly, as a country leaving the EU, as you rightly say, there are many things we need the EU to do because, in a way, it has the critical economic mass, but also, the underlying principles and values that would enable some of the things that need to happen. But are there other countries beyond the EU who you think could be persuaded into the kind of set of actions that are needed to get the sort of momentum that would be needed for a kind of universal approach? So, we all know we need the EU to do certain things. It's doing some of it. It needs to do other things. What other countries do you think could be persuaded to play a role in the kind of movement that's necessary over the next 1 to 2 years?
First, on the architecture issue, I don't believe there is any appetite whatsoever for a new international institution or even process, nor do I think we necessarily need one. I mean, I think if we could get our act together on existing institutions and processes, we have the tools. What we need is the wherewithal to make it happen, which brings me to your question, Creon. I'd say the way forward is indeed coalitions of the willing. I'm struck by the fact, for example, in Canada, which is a federation of 10 provinces and 2 territories, we do not have a national carbon pricing regime. We have a piecemeal regime in which a couple of provinces have joined forces with California on a cap and trade system. We have a couple of provinces that have a carbon tax, as economists would recognize it. And then we have some that kind of think maybe none of the above. And so my point here is that the coalitions of the willing may not going forward just be national. They may well be subnational. And I was struck by the fact that when President Trump removed the US from Paris commitments, several states and cities kind of stepped up and said, but we intend to abide by these. I don't think that's a globally efficient way of doing it, but I do think we have to be open to the idea that this coalition, which might include New Zealand, but not Australia, Canada, but not all of the US, but some states, which are at least as big as Canada, might be the way forward. And I do think, and here I'm sort of speculating, but the impediment to global carbon taxation has come from some unlikely sources, which might be going away. And I think as countries like China and India see the benefits of green technology, invest in it, and see the benefits of cleaner environments, and don't see these as being their fundamental comparative advantage, they can be brought on board as well. But I'd come back to my opening point that to really make this inclusive and bring in some key emerging economies, I think it has to be connected to beyond border carbon adjustments, to issues like IP and perhaps other things that the G20 might talk about. And so my final thought, having said G20, this is the logical place for this kind of architecture and process to be put in place.
Thank you very much. So we are now moving into the sort of final 20 minutes. So I'm very pleased that we've got a number of questions coming through the Q&A, and indeed one on the chat box as well. So if I could encourage everybody who'd like to pose a question to put them through the Q&A, and then I'll put them to the speakers. And perhaps I could kick off with the first question, which comes from Ruth Bergen, and she says that our analysis is that there are a number of provisions across trade deals that would need to change fundamentally to make them compatible with climate ambitions. So regulatory cooperation, investor protection, IP, which we've talked about, procurement rules. And also there is the need for cooperation on the issues that happen outside trade agreements. So how extensive a shift do speakers think is necessary to achieve compatibility between trade and climate? So this is, if you like, going beyond the hard multilateral system and looking at all the different aspects of trade, the trade regime. You know, I mean, it's a good question. You know, how big a change ultimately is going to be needed in order to make this work? So, Jodie, would you like to have a shot at that first, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but I guess it will depend on different countries. You know, the process by which they've negotiated free trade agreements, particularly. Because there are different countries have taken different approaches, and the UK, of course, needs to determine its own route now that it's leaving the EU. But it's been hard, looking at the kind of EU FTAs that have been negotiated. Although there are some common elements when it comes to kind of the sustainable development chapters. There's a lot of variation as well, and it's clear that the texts are the result of the kind of negotiating capacity of the other side. So, if you look at the level of commitments in the EU-Canada agreement, there's a lot in there. Even carbon markets are mentioned, for example. And that would give an example of a kind of high level of ambition, but still, it's the question of enforcement, and that's always been an issue with sustainable development chapters across the EU's approach. So, I think that there's certainly a new opportunity for the UK, but as the UKTPO team and Emily have pointed out, the UK needs to get its own house in order as well, before it starts, trying to call the shots in FTAs. The point about investment, I think that's a very pertinent point, and there's a lot going on in that space at the moment. But yeah, poor LDCs, poor countries, these mineral-rich, natural resource-rich countries, it's surprising that they often have agreements with some of the biggest players. And the balance of power there is very much weighted against them if they were to try to introduce climate change related provisions. And of course, they've got a lot of flexibility at the current time, but that could be quite tricky.
You're on mute, Creon. You're on mute.
Come off. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, so as I said, first of all, thanks to Jodie, and Rohinton may want to comment on that question, but I'd also like, if I may, to put another question alongside it from Sheila Page, which is essentially around, if you like, the the independent data aspects of this issue. And the question really is, you've mentioned there's not a great appetite for new international institutions, but could there be an appetite in the specific space of providing an impartial compilation of analysis on trade, on environment, trade, other data aspects of this, so that it's the kind of issue that comes up with the IMF, where you have the IMF works on providing adjustment programs, but also it does the analysis, and people say, well, these are two in conflict. You can see cases where that's the case. So I imagine there's a similar sort of issue in relation to trade and environment. Do we need a separate body that provides independent analysis? And then you have a policy process which responds to that.
Shall I?
Sorry, Rohinton, if you would like to take that one, yeah.
No, I think Sheila Page makes a good observation. And the example of Simon Evenet's Global Trade Alert is an example of that. In climate change, we do have the IPCC, which is, of course, an intergovernmental organization, but has done hugely important research and analysis and brought it to the public eye. And so we already have a leg up here, that we have the IPCC process, fraught and troubled as it sometimes is, which gives us that platform. But there's nothing to prevent well-meaning others from coming together and creating the observatory, if you will, on issues, and as Sheila says, go beyond trade, to look at IP as well. To give you one sort of recent development, I believe WIPO has created, or will very soon create, a portal that has kind of like Simon's project. Every change in national IP legislation will be sort of tabulated and assessed on this portal. Now that's a public good. Any university or think tank is free to use that information and then create its analysis on what that means for different kinds of welfare. And so I think this kind of institutional analysis is important, because we sometimes forget public opinion here. And I think public opinion has been moved on things like tobacco and on things like cotton subsidies and on things like climate change because of independent analysis and because of the approachable way and the compelling way in which we were shown the facts. And there's room for that here as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, perhaps I could follow the theme on public opinion and the role it plays, and sort of develop that question for you, Jodie, which is, and this has actually come up in a number of discussions about, where next for the G7, for the G20, and so on, where the question is often posed, well, how do you make this relevant to the part of society that is extremely skeptical around, if you like, the elites and global governance more generally? I mean, how do you make issues like trade and climate change relevant in the advanced countries and in the emerging economies as well? And this is one particularly complex area. Trade is already extremely unpopular, trade liberalization in some areas. I mean, do you see this as a way, not just, if you like, of tackling a fundamental issue that's needed in the trade regime, but also, if you like, of re-engaging with a big part of society on the benefits of trade more generally?
Yeah, I guess, we're entering into the COP26 negotiations within the context of COVID. Lots of people are suffering the dire economic consequences. Thankfully, ourselves in this discussion here today, we haven't been as firstly affected, because we can jump and utilize technology so that we can continue to do our jobs. But with international travel restricted and the tourism industry kind of decimated in many parts of the world, there's a 80% reduction in arrivals this year. This is going to have huge economic ramifications. So when that's why I wanted to focus on this point about nature-based solutions. So if you think of many small island states, they do have natural resources that are undervalued. They're undervalued for their biodiversity, they're undervalued for their contribution to the mitigation of climate change. So if, we can get this, get the right price on carbon, which is not going to be easy at all, but we're trying to, steer the global economy into a greener recovery and create new jobs, jobs that have been lost because of COVID, and some of which won't be coming back because people's ways of doing business and working and traveling have changed. So I think that, for me, would be the entry point, particularly for small island developing states and other least developed countries. There's a lot of discussion around, in the finance sphere, kind of debt swaps for climate initiative, trying to resolve the impasse there. But ultimately, we need to be thinking about the productive economy, investing. I think we were discussing about land degradation and the important role of good agricultural practices in helping to increase carbon sequestration, which is valuable. That would be the entry point that I would recommend, and part of this kind of green building back greener.
Thanks very much. Rohinton, maybe I could send the same question to you, which is in a sense complementing what you've said initially around, if you like, the technical, the technocratic approach to this in terms of what you could put in a package. How do you make it appeal to the broader public, particularly perhaps there's two advanced countries and developing countries. There are different issues in each case. There's obviously, you can drive it by the urgency of tackling climate change and so on, but there's quite a few steps to go from that to why we should be doing why you should tell people that they can't have certain kind of goods that, for example, come from areas that have been deforested or things of that kind. This is quite a number of steps. So I just wonder if on that public political question, if there's any views you'd like to give as to what the mechanism should be, and particularly for the people who are planning COP26 next year, how they might go about it.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think you can have a global communications plan and sort of hire a global PR firm and expect global public opinion to change. And that's one of the sort of flaws in that COP way of doing things, is let's not put too much weight on COP. It is a process and one event, and many people are turned off by it. I think we have to understand that these are longer term processes, that different parts of the world sort of just see things differently, but that people are fundamentally intelligent, and that this is where subsidiarity in communications is really important. We've done it before, maybe not to the satisfaction of everyone, but I come back to my example of tobacco and how views have changed on tobacco, even in countries where, norms around tobacco use were not uniform. And yet we now find that anti-tobacco legislation is broadly uniform around the world. So now in climate change, it might not happen as quickly as the climate is changing, but I still think that there's room for compelling evidence. And as you said, let's not discount the fact that the people who have to breathe really bad air all the time are not going to buy into sort of nostrums about this is disguised protectionism and so on. People are going to want cleaner air wherever they might be. And so I do think we have to create the evidence, present it in ways that perhaps governments and international agencies are always not best at doing so. My example is the way Oxfam was effective in raising sort of issues around agricultural subsidies and cotton subsidies at a time that, technocrats and the economics community kind of knew how this was not a good thing, but you do need that knowledge translation. And it has been happening for some time in climate change, perhaps not as fast as it might be, but I don't think that COP necessarily has anything to add in terms of making climate communications friendlier. There's other ways to do it. Let's not put that to international bureaucrats.
Thanks very much. We've talked about, if you like, the technocratic government policymakers. We talked about the public, but another really key actor in this is big multinational companies. And obviously, we're very conscious of the big push towards ESG, investment, the movement for profit with purpose, and so on. And you know, many of these companies are right at the edge, or right at the heart of many of the issues we've discussed today. So, as a final thought, I wonder if I could come to both of you on this question, which is, you know, what is this? If we're going to mobilize this aspect of multinational companies to help address the nexus of issues on trade and climate change, again, where, you know, what should we be asking them to do? Where should we begin? You know, which sectors do you think there's the biggest scope to make rapid progress? And how far, and, you know, are there things that even if the governments aren't leading, they can do to facilitate action by the big multinationals in helping address this issue? So if you could both perhaps respond to that question as the final question. There are others who keep popping in, but I'm afraid I may not have time to get to them. But Jodie, do you want to go first on that question around the role of multinationals?
Yeah, so I'll just try to be brief. The UK has launched the Race to Zero, which is trying to, you know, champion firms to achieve net zero by 2030, and that's, you know, received a lot of attention by big multinational firms. Google, for example, has joined that initiative. I think that, you know, there's also recent initiative on the UK preventing firms in the UK from sourcing products from deforested land areas, but that relies more on you know, a kind of due diligence and whether local laws have been adhered to. I think that, you know, we probably, I kind of do like the kind of more legalistic approach. You know, I don't think that we can rely on private voluntary initiatives for this. I think that governments will need to be bolder. I think perhaps the EU is going a little bit, you know, too far in terms of, you know, the prominence that it's giving to border carbon adjustment measures. But I do think that we need to create the right balance of incentives, you know, that and it's all tied up with the issues around carbon markets and pricing and all of that. So it's going to be quite tough. But I think that would really be my answer to your question, is that, you know, we can't see this as can't see the actions by firms as something discrete. It's kind of it needs to be part of this integrated framework and all of these issues, you know, tying up together. So it's likely to be highly country specific, which is also could be problematic, given that multinational firms, you know, where they're based, and you know, the issues around the kind of ownership structures. You know, the OECD is trying to tackle that. Perhaps this is also one kind of avenue that would also need to be considered.
Thanks very much. And Rohinton, perhaps to you, I mean, what sort of role do you see for multinational companies on this nexus of issues? And there's also a question that Ingo has asked in the Q&A about it's the sort of the negative side that actually, you know, as new technology becomes more and more important, you could see the market power of the big companies becoming that much greater. And so there is a question of how do you sort of check that market power? I mean, I think to some extent you were already answering that by saying actually reduce some of the legal protections that technology has. But perhaps you could look at those two issues together, and your view of how much we should expect from multinationals, and to the extent we expect some things, how we should get them channeled in the right direction.
I think in some ways Ingo's question is just the mirror image of the one previously, and so you're right, Creon. But I guess, and I know we're running it, I'd say briefly, moral suasion goes only so far, and we simply cannot expect private firms to sort of do social good for its own sake. That is why I'm struck by the fact, and I take at face value, by the way, the number of energy firms that welcome a carbon price. I think they do because it creates a backstop for everyone. It prevents damaging races to the bottom. And so, you know, firm X does not have to worry about firm Y being ruthless in going to the bottom if firm X fundamentally believes in a cleaner environment. And so increasingly international legislation provides that backstop. It also provides, carbon pricing also provides investment certainty and provides firm financial horizons. It takes away one unknown, which is at what point will government step in to save the environment. And so I do think we need legislation, not just to do good, but precisely to bring the private sector on board and give the private sector certainty in these kinds of issues.
Thank you. I mean, I very much agree with you. I think the real dilemma we have with the present state of multilateral economic cooperation is that the ability to get that kind of guidance, even when companies want it, or rules, is very hard. And you also do have the situation of, you know, you may have one side of a company that sort of says in public, yeah, we'd like to have good rules and follow them. And then another part of the company is funding lobbyists who are doing precisely the opposite in terms of, you know, trying to reduce and minimize the rules that are being created either at national or international level. So it's tough. But I'm afraid we're out of time now. And I would just like to, well, first of all, thank our audience for listening and for some very good questions, but also particularly to thank our two panelists, Rohinton and Jodie, for their comments. I think you've elucidated a really important area that's coming up over the next 12 months or so. I think, Rohinton, you've sort of made the point that actually we shouldn't hang too much on COP26, but you know, when you're spending several $100 million on a summit and you've got 30,000 people turning up and so on, you know, it's hard to resist the desire to hang quite a bit on such an event. And also, I'd like to thank Ingo and Tina for all the arrangements. So I think magically Alan has appeared. So with that, Alan, I'll pass over to you. And thank you again, everybody, for taking part.
Okay. Thank you very much to the speakers, but also to Creon for making it such a lively session. I'm not going to spend any time telling you what you've heard or what you've missed. We've moved from tiny issues about which we don't know very much, how firms react to a change in preferences, to huge issues about how we're going to reconfigure the world market. International trade is really right at the center of this global world that we have now. And so the set of challenges that we're facing is just deeply interesting. So let me say thank you to everyone for coming. Let me urge you to come back tomorrow. We've got a very interesting program tomorrow about the impact of Brexit uncertainty, political economy of global value chains, and then trade and economic cohesion in Britain going forward. It's been great fun this afternoon. I'm sure it will be great fun and inspiring tomorrow afternoon. So thank you very much. It's good to see everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Goodbye.